Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Li O11D EVO RGB. This is an in-depth look at a pretty fantastic case with some really nice highlights. Here I'm going to show you various different builds that I've done in this case, where I'm going to demonstrate the different things that are possible, talk about the various different features and specs of the case, show you all the highlights and things that I discovered along the way, things to bear in mind if you're thinking about buying it and building in it. For example, did you know that you can build upside down in here with a reverse build? You can also do various other things like removing a support bar so you can see inside the glass to make the most of the RGB lighting, and things like Lian Li's TL LCD fans that you can see here. I'm going to do a separate video on, as well as optional extras like a vertical GPU mount system so you can show off your graphics card, and upright GPU, as well as a front mesh panel. There's loads of things that are possible with the EVO RGB, and this is another upgrade to the previous system. Now you'll notice that I've built in here with both Lian Li products and Corsair because I want to show off both the TL LCD fans and Corsair's IQ Link upgrade kit with the LCD display on there. So I'm going to do some videos on both those things in the near future, but here I want to demonstrate what it was like. And let me tell you, this has been quite an experience to build in this case in so many different ways. It's taken me quite a bit of time, so you're going to see a sample of that now as we go through all the different things, and bear with me now. So what you can see initially is when you first get out of the box that it is really easy to take apart. The glass panels, as you'll see, just pull away and then you get access to the inside. Here's a look at some of the possibilities. For example, did you know that you can top mount a push-pull radiator setup in here? So there's actually 6 fans on that radiator. Now this case offers the ability to put your motherboard in either low or high positions, which is something similar to previously in the cases that you're able to do. You can see the 2 variations there. This allows you to then obviously get more space at the bottom if you've got a thicker radiator, which would be ideal if you're doing a custom liquid cooled system, for example, and you need a thicker radiator at the bottom and other space down there. Now, as a standard installation, you put the motherboard in on the standoffs as you would in any other case, and this is the position that you'd set it in there. But there are some highlights here initially. You'll see, for example, there's a little bracket at the top of where the I/O shielding goes that you can take off and then swap the position of depending on how you're mounting the motherboard. This is useful for mounting in the high and low positions, but also for reverse building if you're considering doing that. Now, the standoffs on here have a little tool that allows you to remove them. Now, this is fairly unusual because, as standard, most cases you'll have a tool like this for perhaps putting in an extra standoff for E-ATX motherboards. But in this instance, if you want to maneuver the motherboard into the upper position, so the high position, you have to remove all the standoffs and then put them in the additional spots that you can see marked with little arrows. So you have to basically just shift them all up, which takes a little bit of time and is a little bit of a faff. Now, most people might not need to do this. You may well just keep your motherboard in the low standard position, as I've done actually in my builds. But if you want to move it up into the higher position, you do have to go through that process to maneuver those. So that's something to bear in mind. And this actually comes across with a lot of the things that you need to do if you're customizing it into the inverted reverse build, so upside down. That takes a lot more effort. I'm going to do a video on that separately, going into all the steps of that, but you have to remove a lot of things in order to do that. What was interesting to me is if you look at the Evo XL, you can see that it has a motherboard tray that you can mount the motherboard to, and then that's removable, and then you can mount that in the different positions. That was much more convenient and made life a lot easier because not only do you have access to the back of the motherboard really easily, but also you could just move it in the various positions when building, which makes it far easier if you need to maneuver cables in from the bottom, for example, when building. That's not to say that the O11D EVO RGB isn't a pretty awesome case though. Out of the box, a really nice looking premium design to it. Obviously some very nice highlights and a solid build quality, as with all Lian Li cases in my experience. Nice and solid, really well built, really well thought out. You'll see lots of venting for various different panels on here, so there's plenty of good airflow and some other interesting highlights to it as well that I want to get into. For example, you'll see that both the power supply unit tray and the hard disk drive tray jut out from the back and are movable. Now, the reason you'd want to move them is to swap them around if you're mounting it in the upside down mode. So you'd then position the power supply unit at the top instead of at the bottom, and you can basically switch these around. But what's interesting here as well is that you'll notice that the power supply unit shroud juts out from the back, which means if you have a bigger PSU, you can put it in there and still have plenty of room for your cabling on the inside. Now this is a 1000 watt PSU, which is actually reasonably sized, but you will notice there's plenty of space there for the cables on the inside. You also have this bracket in here for cable management, which is adjustable, and it has various different Velcro loops throughout the case as well, but there's plenty of space in there for the cabling in this dual channel setup, as you can see. Now, I'll give you another angle view of how much those things stick out the rear. So both the SSD and hard disk drive cage and the power supply unit stick out at the rear a little bit, which means you just have more space on the inside. A really smart design, I think, because for the most part, this is probably going to be at the back of your desk. You're not going to see it, so it doesn't really matter if it sticks out a bit, and that gives you more room. If you've got a high-end build with a really big power supply unit, that's definitely going to be welcome. The other thing that you'll notice here as well, from this angle, is the glass makes some nice reflections of the RGB. You'll see a bit more of that later on. Now, once you've got this open, you'll notice there are some other interesting highlights to this. So there are various different points where you can mount both hard drives and SSDs. You'll see out of the box that it has these trays mounted to the fan tray on the side of the case here. And this is kind of weird in my opinion, and I don't know how many people will use this, but you can mount SSDs and hard disk drives to these as an alternative to the other places, which I'll show you in a second, and then obviously stick them on the side. Now that would negate the use of your fans on the side there, and as you've seen from the initial clips, I mounted both radiator and fans there, so I want to show you that in a second. But if you want to, you can put a lot of storage in here potentially. So it comes with these rubber standoffs, obviously anti-vibration mounts, which would be ideal for your hard disk drives, which means that you can mount one 3.5-inch hard disk drive to each of these trays or two SSDs. You can then mount that in there and then just clip it back in place, and obviously it's nestled away at the back of the case and you've got plenty of storage there. So if storage is the name of the game and the most important thing to you, then you can obviously mount a lot of drives in here, and I'll show you the other positions in a minute. I personally wouldn't do this, but it speaks to the flexibility of the case and the different builds that you can do with it. So you can see a demo of how easily those mount in and then clip into place there, and that's the sort of setup that you could have. So again, two SSDs on one tray, one hard disk drive on the other, or maybe four SSDs on there. Now the standard installation, which is a bit easier, is just putting the brackets on the drive itself on an SSD and then slipping it into this door here. So you can actually mount two drives on the inside of the door, and then obviously all the cabling's hidden away at the rear, and that's probably a more logical thing to do for most people and easier. You also have the hard disk drive / SSD cages at the rear, where you can either mount one hard disk drive or one SSD in each of them. Theoretically, you could mount 4 drives on the fan tray, another 2 on that SSD panel, and then another 2 in this hard disk drive cage at the rear, which means that you can basically put loads of drives in here. Now you'll notice this is obviously removable, and it just slides into place. Again, slots in there. It's held in place with thumb screws. The nice thing about this as well is that this means that you don't actually have to use this if you don't want to. So if you have a lot of controllers or a lot of cables or a lot of other things that you want to manage at the back, or you just want to access the back of the motherboard, you can take those cages out. Now you can see we do have a lot of space for cabling. Even if you are a messy cabler like I am and you're not great at cable management, you can still close that door really easily. Now the fan tray that I showed you where you mount those SSDs also comes off and is repositionable. So there's a little switch at the top here, basically a button that you push in that unleashes it, and then you can take that out. Now the interesting thing about this is it can be flipped around, mounted the other way. You can mount radiators to it. You can mount it both directions, up and down and back and forth, and it will just slide into place really easy. This makes the installation of things really straightforward, because obviously you can mount the radiator to it when it's outside of the case, or you can keep it in there and mount it while it's inside, and then you can position it the way you want, and you could flip it round really easily. The build in this is very straightforward as standard, and really easy to do. You will notice in the low position there's a lot of room at the top of the motherboard for your cabling. Now alternatively, you could obviously mount fans on there, so these reverse blade LCD fans make a logical alternative. You'll notice here that I've mounted them the opposite way around, so now the cage is sitting with the sort of spacious bit of it sitting towards the back. You can also mount the upright GPU mount on this tray as well, and you'll see that there is room at the back potentially to mount your radiator if you want instead. So you can put a 360mm radiator on the rear here, and then mount your fans on the front of it, and maybe do push-pull setup as an alternative. So there's plenty of different options on there. I should note as well that I'll leave in the description all the specs of the case, but you'll notice that there's room to mount up to 3 140mm fans on that side tray, and the same for the top and bottom as well, but only one 120mm fan at the rear. Now obviously I've mounted a 360mm radiator on the top there instead of on the side panel to give you some variety in the options there. You can actually mount up to a 420mm radiator at the top of the case as well. There are additional brackets required for this which are included with the case, so it is surprisingly roomy, although I will note that you don't seem to be able to mount 4 120mm fans on the top or the bottom of either of the trays, which is something to note. It was something that you could do with the Evo XL. Another additional purchase is the upright GPU mount, so you can mount a GPU on the side there. Now I will note it was a lot more fiddly than it was in the Evo XL, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it was a lot of hassle with the big 4070 that I had in there. 3090 looks tiny in the Evo XL by comparison, but I found it a little bit tricky to install, so not necessarily great. But you do have the option of the reverse build, which is also fairly curious and quirky, and a massive undertaking to do, as I said, because you have to remove the feet, put them on the top, remove various different brackets, swap around other things. There's a lot of different steps to that, so I want to do a separate video. The other thing I noticed when I put this into the reverse build is that there is a gap in the glass panels when you remove the support bracket. So there is an ever so slightly small gap between the two bits of glass there when it's in the reverse build. Not something I noticed when it's in the standard format, which was unusual, but something to bear in mind. You may well notice there, but we all see that you do have this support bracket that's there as standard, and you can take that out so you can see into the case more easily. I personally rather keep this in place if you're going to be moving the PC around a lot, but once you've finished building it, you can then take that out and get a good view in there. And I didn't find that this reduced the stability of the case. It was still nice and stable, feels really solid, and so that shouldn't be a problem. You can see from multiple angles that this looks really nice in this position. Now, worth noting as well that the case is available in white and black, and apparently the black version has slightly tinted glass, so maybe the white one will look nicer there, but I haven't got the black one to be able to show. Although there are a lot of additional purchases, there are a lot of things included as standard with this case. So you have a little package full of all the different screws and other things. I've already mentioned that you have the brackets included for the 420mm radiator setup. The other thing that you get is an anti-sag bracket for your graphics card, which is a nice standard option. So it's included as standard and work with both E-ATX and ATX motherboards. The installation process is also really straightforward. Essentially, this is just a small bracket which mounts on top of the motherboard. It uses extra standoffs, so you mount your motherboard in there, and then you have standoffs that sit on top of the motherboard, and then this bracket sits on top of those, and then that's screwed into place on top of that and secured down. There are a few steps to set it up initially beforehand, but once you've done that with a standard ATX motherboard, it's really easy to install. This is a nice option, especially when you consider the size and weight of the current top-end graphics cards and just how much pressure they're going to be putting on your PCIe slot. You can see how this works here. It basically has a little button on the side and then allows you to adjust the position up and down to then support your graphics card. Now this is nice because obviously it's not going to interfere with the fans as other support brackets may, because a lot of the ones I've seen usually sit on the bottom of the case and then push up underneath the GPU. This one is flush back against the motherboard essentially, so it doesn't get in the way of anything, and it's really easy to put into place there and then give you the extra support that you need. The other thing you'll notice is even in the low position for the motherboard, there's still plenty of space for the power cable to run from underneath the motherboard through to your graphics card as well. This is obviously a 600 watt PSU cable, but that's running from underneath past the fans and then connecting up. The vertical GPU mount also sits in there quite nicely, and how that's positioned is going to vary depending on where you've got your motherboard. This is in a low position. You'll notice how close that is to the fans. Maybe moving the motherboard up there might be an option, but that is an additional purchase, so that is an extra purchase. Now, another thing about the case is you can reposition the I/O. So the front panel connectors for USB-A, USB-C and 3.5mm can be put in 3 different positions on the case. So you've got side, front and then rear for some reason, so you can put it at the back of the case if you want to. And this is obviously also useful if you're doing the reverse build, because you'd have to take that module out and then reposition it. Another thing that you can do is you can buy an additional I/O kit, which includes 2 extra USB-A and 1 USB-C connection. Now, I will note that I wouldn't recommend this for most people, because you will need a motherboard which will support it, and I haven't seen very many motherboards that have an additional front panel USB-C connector and an additional USB-A connector. Sometimes I've seen some with USB-As, but not very often. But if you do happen to have a really flashy motherboard with those extra connections, you can run these cables in there and then set it up so you can have multiple front panel connectors. So you can see I've got one on the front and the side here, which gives you 4 USB-As, 2 USB-Cs and the 3.5mm. On the underside, you have a dust cover which is held in place with magnets, and obviously, as I've shown, you've got the rear panel with various different venting holes on it, and the top panel also has a lot of holes in it as well. So there's some good dust protection there. Now, when you're taking things apart, you'll notice that the fan trays are removable. I've already shown you the rear one. Both the top and bottom can be removed easily. They are held in place with a thumb screw on the bottom, and the top one has 2 screws holding it in place as well as some clips. You don't necessarily need to take the top one out, because you can mount the radiator or fans on there while it's installed. There's 320mm fans up there now, and you can see there's quite a bit of space on either side of them, but you'll also notice you've got multiple mounting points there, so you can theoretically put them further forward if you wanted to, and obviously move them side to side. You can also mount 140mm fans up there to fill it up a bit more, or if you put a radiator on top, with a 360mm radiator in this instance, you can see that fills up the tray a bit more. But again, you've got choice in where to mount that, because you could push it back a little bit, for example. I didn't have any problems with the mounting and installation of things in terms of the amount of space that you've got towards the motherboard, for example, and other things. There's just plenty of room to build in here, and it's a really nice and easy setup to do in a variety of ways. Obviously, the O11D EVO RGB has RGB in its name because it has a lot of RGB lighting. Besides just putting extra fans in there with RGB, you can control the RGB lighting strips. So you'll notice both top and bottom, running across the front and the side, you've got RGB strip here, which lights up and has various different controls on it. Now, you can adjust through various different RGB effects on there. You can also turn the brightness up and down with buttons on the side of the case. This is said to be diffused in the same way Lian Li's Strimmer's RGB connections are. So you've got some nice RGB lighting on there as well. And it looks pretty swish if you're into that RGB. This is definitely nice because previously in the case it was basically one strip down the front. So if you had your case angled, you wouldn't see any of that. Now, on the inside of the case, you'll notice there are cables for this. Important that you connect both this SATA power connection and 5V RGB if you want to make the most of it. I'm going to go into a build guide on this case in the near future to talk about how to set it up properly if you're interested. But essentially, with this RGB lighting, you can connect up to a 5V, for example, JA RGB header on your motherboard, which will then mean that you can control that RGB lighting strip from your motherboard software, in this case MSI's Mystic Light, by connecting up that 5V cable. And then obviously you need to make sure as well that you connect up the SATA power from your power supply unit to that connector, otherwise those strips won't light up in the first place. I've had people ask this on previous review videos, so just a quick snippet of that. You need those 2 cables in order to make the most of those RGB strips. So what you've seen is a really flexible case with plenty of different build options and some really nice highlights. Decent airflow from what I've seen. It's got nice tall feet, so it sits off the desk nicely. You've got good intake at the rear, plenty of space for your cabling at the rear as well, and a nice amount of space for the power supply unit and all the cables and the setup there. It's got some really nice features to it. It looks great from multiple angles because you've got all that RGB shining onto the glass, and also highly visible if you've got something like these TL fans with the infinity mirrors down the side of them. And it's fantastic for loads of different reasons. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to see more content on this and Lian Li's fans, and check out the links in the description to find out more. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.